Hello everyone, this is Mr. Davies, and today we're going to talk a little bit about the ACT test that's coming up. So on Tuesday, March, I believe that's 9th, the juniors are going to be taking the ACT. Sophomores, next year is your opportunity to do this. So this is kind of meant to do two things. One, juniors, give you a little bit of heads up on what you're going to see in just a couple more days. Sophomores, kind of plant some seeds to kind of be thinking about for what the science portion, and the science portion really only of the ACT is really where we're focusing. So that's what the intent of this video is. Your homework assignment to go along with this video is to take notes. So jot down some things on a piece of paper, somewhere, notebook, scratch piece of paper, we don't really care. Jot some important things down about the science portion, you know, like how long is it? How many questions is it? What are some strategies? Things like that, and then take a picture and submit it. Pretty straightforward. If you want some additional practice, especially you juniors, there are 3 different passage types that we will address in this video, and then we'll post some of those in Canvas that if you want to go through and you want to mark those up and submit them, Mr. DeGrand and I will go through and grade them for right versus wrong, and so you can at least see that. So that's the idea. It'll be an optional homework assignment. You don't have to do them, but if you do, we'll grade them. We'll give you feedback. If you choose not to do it, we will excuse you from them. So just so you're aware of that, that's the idea of this activity, to kind of give you some exposure to the ACT. So science portion of the ACT. First of all, what the heck is the ACT? What do all these scores mean? Just so you are aware, a perfect score on the ACT is a 36. So you have different passages. You have the 4 listed here on this screen: the English, math, reading, science. Sometimes the writing is given as well. 36 is considered perfect. So what's a good score? Well, ACT went through and decided that there's these things called benchmarks. And in science, if you get a 23 on the ACT, they're saying that you have a pretty good chance, 50% chance or a 75% chance of getting a B or C or better in your freshman biology class, so in college. So all this is meant to be is an indicator that they are claiming that if you get a 23 on the ACT science portion, that you have a high probability of being successful in college. So that's why colleges kind of use this as an indicator. Now there's less of them, I think, taking it because of the pandemic, but that's just kind of where we are right now. So that's the intent of this. So what the heck is how do we do this? I'm going to say this, I don't know how many times in this video. Answer every question, answer every question, answer every question, answer every question. Pacing, 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 pacing. That's so huge on these tests, all of these tests. Whether you're doing English reading, writing, English reading, math, or science, do not leave a question blank. Do not leave a question blank. Make sure you at least guess, put an answer, fill in a bubble on every single question, because a blank answer is a wrong answer. So if nothing else, there's 5 minutes left, bubble, 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 fill in letters, put something down. You have at least a shot of getting it right. So science, pacing, pacing, pacing. You have a total of 40 questions to do in 35 minutes. 40 questions in 35 minutes. The intent of this the intent of the ACT is to put pressure on you and not give you ample opportunity, but to try to make it so you're rushing to get through to see what you can accomplish. They generally have what we refer to as 6 passages. That kind of change a little bit, but again, pacing, pacing, pacing. I'm sorry, I circled the wrong thing. Like every 5 to 6 minutes, there's going to be probably 6 passages. And if you take 6 divided by 35, you should be like turning the page about every 5 minutes. That's kind of my rule of thumb, is every 5 minutes you should be turning a page. Because if you do so, you will have enough time and you'll get at least a shot to have read everything. So there's certain passages that take a little longer. So kind of if you're getting hung up, maybe you skip it and come back. Just make sure you fill something in at the end. Okay, so how do you know? Well, you can kind of peek at the last page in the science portion, and then that will tell you how many passages. They changed it, but typically what we've been seeing in the last 5 years is 6 passages. So you get right around the 6 minutes. So, but my general rule is every 5 minutes you should be turning that page. So what does ACT suggest? They suggest that you read the passage and then you answer the questions. You are supposed to choose the best answer, not the right answer. So just kind of be aware of that. The test really doesn't, it's not a content test. It's not going to ask you biology questions that you should have learned in our biology class. It's not going to ask you chemistry questions that you should have learned in chemistry, because a lot of you haven't taken chemistry yet. It's really stresses skills, graphs, and data. There are a few things, and we'll talk about those a little bit, but it's really not a content test. I'll be honest, it's more of a reading test and reading graphs kind of test. So again, I mentioned this. Is it okay to skip a question? No, never, ever, ever leave a question blank. A blank response is a wrong response. Okay, so at the end, at least bubble it in. And if you want, come back and double check it if you have extra time. But at least go in and bubble your answer at the end of each passage. So when you turn the page, put a bubble in so you don't have to come back to it. If you have time, circle in your book, come back to it, but don't make any stray marks on your answer. So how do they kind of break it down? We really are going to emphasize passage format. So there's 3 types of passages, and based upon these 3 types of passages, kind of depends upon the strategies. So a lot of it, like I said, is about reading graphs and interpreting data from that. So there's graphs, there's tables. Make sure you know what's in each graph, what they're trying to show, and what's in each column and heading. But when we look at this data, we're really trying to look at data sets. You don't get a calculator, so anytime they ask you to like come up with a number, it's not a calculated function. It should be like an estimate based upon even a graph, either a graph or trends within the data. But really, like I said, this is a reading test. It really is testing your reading skills, comparing and contrasting, and kind of interpreting models in graphs. So just be aware of that. There are certain science vocab that they do expect you to know. These are a list of some of the things they just expect you to know. You know, they expect you to know what a variable is. Independent, dependent variables that we talked about at the beginning of the year. Acceleration, pH. Oh, it's low pH of like 2 is very acidic, or 14 is very basic. Things like that. But like in the grand scheme of the 40 questions, there's maybe 2 questions that actually ask you directly things that you should have known. Everything else is going to be, if there's a definition that they are going, a science concept, they're going to teach you it, or they're going to give you what it means in the passage. Then you got to use that along the way. Again, no calculators. It's really very time consuming, so make sure you get every question answered. Again, 3 passage types, and that's what we're going to talk about. So there's one of these passages is called data representation. Generally, there's 2 or 3 of those per test. And again, about every page you should be turning, about every 5 minutes you should be turning a page. How do you know if it's a data representation? Lots of graphs, lots of table, very little text. Okay, so what do? They always talk about actively reading. And when we talk about actively reading, you know, you're reading the passage and you'll be like, oh, there's 2 or 3 passages. You can't use a highlighter, but you can circle and underline. It should be about 4 or 5 minutes. Actively read. You know, that's what you're doing. You're circling, you're underlining, because as you do that, it's helping you like connect some dots in your brain so that you're going to remember that. So you can, when you come back, you'll be able to say, oh yeah, that I already looked at that. That's in this section right here. They always talk about reading the passage first, though. And then when you go through, don't try to figure out anything beyond what they ask you. So the questions, they'll often give you more data, and they'll also be very specific, like according to table 2 or according to figure 1, then look at that table and that figure. Sometimes they'll ask you to combine the 2, but be very specific. They're pretty specific as what you're supposed to look at. So again, about every 5 minutes, you should be turning a page. The next passage that we're going to talk about is called research summary. Okay, so there's data representation, lots of graphs, very little text, mostly graphs and tables and charts. Research summary is a little bit different. There's less of these. There's generally 2 or 3. So kind of there tends to be like 1 less. It's a combination of both text and data. So there are some graphs, there are some tables, but then there's more text. They often talk about like it's called experiment 1, and then there's a graph with some narration. Experiment 2, a graph with some narration. This takes a little bit longer, so like ACT kind of says, oh, more around the 5 minutes and 20 seconds. Again, my general rule of thumb is like every 5 minutes you should be turning the page. Every 5 minutes you should be flipping that page over. So kind of keep that in mind. Pacing, pacing, pacing. Don't leave any answers blank. So the idea is you're going to go through and you're going to read the passage first. You're going to actively annotate, underline keywords, figure out what they're testing, why they're testing. And then, again, don't spend extra time trying to figure out everything on the table because there's extra information. Don't try to figure out who's right or wrong. That's not what they're asking. Just go through, answer the questions that are being given, but read the passage first. Then they'll be very specific. According to experiment 1 or according to study number 2, what conclusion could be drawn? Sometimes they'll ask you to say, oh, according to study 1 and number 2, what would they say? So there's some of those too. The last passage type is the longest. I always suggest students leave this one for last because it's 100% reading, and it takes the most time. So I always say spend the time where you think you can get the most points. Some people think they like this one the best, but the idea is it's really just reading. So identifying if there's like almost no graphs, no tables, skip it. Make sure you come back to it. Make sure you come back to it and make sure you don't screw up your Scantron. But the idea is it's just a long passage. The way you can identify it is called conflicting viewpoints because they talk about what does scientist 1 versus scientist 2 say, or what does student 1 versus student say, or what is the Davies hypothesis compared to the DeGrand hypothesis, or the Davies theory versus the DeGrand theory. And it's going to ask you to compare those two viewpoints and look for some similar trends. This takes longer. I would skip it, and then come back to it when you have time. Read the passage, underline keywords, annotate it. Things to be thinking about is where do they agree and where do they disagree? And then there's usually some implications along the way. They're going to ask you to compare and contrast the similarities between these things. Again, I encourage you to save this one for last. So, in a nutshell, do your best. Pacing, 40 questions, 35 minutes. About every 5 minutes, you should be turning a page. And, where is that? Blank response is a wrong response. So at least have a guess, even if it's a. Okay, just fill something in. Don't leave anything blank. If you have questions, talk to Mr. DeGrand, talk to Mr. Davies, and we can kind of help you out with some of these things. We do have some practice information that we will make sure that we post in Canvas, that if you want to spend some time going through these 3 categories, you get some opportunities. Have a great day.